I love applewood and I love crotch pieces. This week's project is both, so thank you for joining in. But this week's project also includes a failure. So stay tuned and see how I dealt with that. Again, thank you for watching. Okay, what am I going to do with this? This was an apple crotch. It was a nice piece of wood, and it's big. But when I put it on the lathe, this is what happened. This is bark. This is all bark. Because of the crotch and the movement, that opened up, bark grew in there, and that's got no strength, so it came apart. I should have seen it. I should have CA glued it ahead of time, although I'll be honest with you, I think it's too big to have been able to catch it. I did take some safety precautions, obviously a face shield, not that this piece coming off hitting a face shield certainly would have done some physical damage. But I was standing out of the line of fire. That was mounted in my chuck, and I was standing over here the whole time. When that comes off, and I apologize, I don't have the video of it coming off, it's going to go that way, it's going to come out, and it's going to go back. So if you're standing over here, you're pretty safe. Still no guarantee. I'm not promoting this behavior, but standing out of the line of fire is the best thing that you can do. It is apple. I'd still like to save it. Question is how I do it. Obviously, the answer is epoxy. If you follow my channel, you know two things about me. I don't do a lot of epoxy, and I'm cheap. So some people would just put this in a bucket and fill the whole thing full of epoxy and then turn all this epoxy away. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to try and clean up these two edges, put it back together, and just pour epoxy in the gap. And do it that way. I'm going to try and get rid of this. I can still mount this piece. I'm going to try and get rid of this high section here and thin it out a bit. It'll be easier to turn in the future, and it'll be less epoxy again. And it's still wet, so even after I do that, I'm going to have to put it in my kiln and let it dry, because if I pour epoxy into wet wood, when that wet wood tries to dry, it will try and move, and it'll put a lot of stress on the epoxy. So I'm going to let it dry a bit more before I put epoxy on it. So let's go ahead, get this cleaned up, try and turn a little bit of this away and see what I can do with that, and then we'll come back. So the first thing you may notice is that I removed the icicle that was in the bottom of this bowl. I just did that on my bandsaw and cut it away the best I could, just to thin it down and get rid of that lump. The next thing that I did was use my flap wheel sander to just clean up some of that bark. You don't want to leave loose bark anywhere that you're going to put two surfaces together. One reason is because bark is weak. The other thing is you don't want it flaking off into your epoxy. The next thing you'll notice is that I've got some spacers here. I just want to hold that crack apart for two reasons. One, for appearances, to get some epoxy to be able to go in there, so I've got a bit of a gap to fill so that you'll see it in the end. And secondly, structural. Now that I've done that, I'm using hot melt glue. That is the best way of attaching your form, and I'm using a plastic shelf liner here, as I mentioned. And I'm putting a double row on each side of the crack with hot melt glue and pushing that shelf liner right down into the glue to make sure that I get a good seal. You don't want any epoxy leaking out once you've started pouring it. Once I have the shelf liner glued down, then I just cover it with duct tape and make sure that I press it really hard in case I have any gaps in my hot melt glue. Now I'll just repeat the process on the inside, but on the inside I'm actually doing it in two pours, just because I want to make sure that I get epoxy down into that crack. I don't want to form it all the way to the top and just fill from the top. So I'm just filling it up forming it up halfway here so I can see the bottom. That'll leave me large open areas that I can pour the epoxy into. And I can also tamp it down, just tapping the bowl on the table itself to make sure that that epoxy has flowed in through all of the cracks in the bottom. Once I do that, then I'll start forming up the outside. As long as you don't let the epoxy sit for a long period of time, you can do 2 pours. The danger of doing 2 pours is if it is set and you come back days later and try and top it up, you will see what's called a witness line. You'll see where one pour stopped and another pour started, even if you do get an exact color match, which is almost impossible. So in this case, speaking of color, I'm using both a red and a white. I like to put white in my coloring. It gives it more of that pearlesque view to it and gives it more interest. So I'm just going to mix up the epoxy here. I just mix it by hand and start with one. This is a 2-part epoxy because it's a deep pour. It's a 2-part, equal part epoxy. And I'll mix those up and then I add my pigment. So I'm just adding, in this case, 1 small scoop of white, and I will add 3 scoops of the red. So it will be predominantly red with just a little bit of white mixed in with it. When it comes to epoxy, you can do it 2 different ways. You can mix the 2 colors together, as I'm doing here, or you can mix up 2 separate epoxies, one that was red, one that's white, and pour one then the other. That's going to give you much more of a swirl effect. You will see 2 very distinct colors, but in this case, I don't want it to be that distinct. I'm okay with mixing them together in one batch. Now you can see here, again, I'm only filling it up halfway, but this is giving me a really good view of that bottom piece. So what I did was I poured it in on the right-hand side, not pouring any on the left, excuse my head, and just tipped it over until I saw it appear on the left-hand side. And then I knew that I had epoxy coming all the way through that gap. Now that I've got it through, I'm pouring it on both sides, and as I pour it on the left, I wait until I see it rise on the right and vice versa. Now I apologize, I did not show it, but I just ended up forming up the rest of that inside and finished pouring it right to the top. Once that's dried for a day, I stripped it off, and then I flattened the bottom out here. I'm just using my angle grinder with a flap wheel disc on it, and I'm just flattening it out so that I can put a glue block on it. You've seen me on my channel before using a glue block. 2 important things. 1, make sure it's flat. 2, make sure that you've got really good glue coverage. And again, I use an electric frying pan and I dip it in so that I make sure that I get lots of glue between the 2 surfaces. So now I'm just working at truing up the bowl. Every time you mount and remount it, it's going to be off a little bit. Plus this bowl has moved as it's dried, so I've got to true it back up again. I start with the top surface, make sure that's flat, and then once I've done that, I'll move around to the outside and again true that up. Now I did have some fine cracks in it. For the most part, they only appeared on the outside. They didn't go all the way through. So as I true it up, and I also have to thin it down, I want to concentrate on removing that material from the outside and hopefully get rid of as many of the cracks as I can. So, just want to talk about safety. I've talked before on my channel about being in a line of fire. I don't know if you can see where I am Yes, you can. I'm here. This is directly in the line of fire. If this bowl were to come off, it's coming directly at me. It's going to hit me in the face or in the chest. So, I don't stand here in this line of fire when the bowl is rough. Because when it's rough, that means it's coming around. I might hit here and then not again to over here. And it's violent because it's a banging motion. And it's that motion that can cause it to come out of the chuck, can cause the tendon to break. All kinds of bad things can happen when it's rough. So I do not stand in this position until it's smooth. When it's smooth and I'm riding the bevel, it's not rough. And by this time, the joint here, the glue joint, has already had a good test because it's turned rough. I make sure that my chuck is tight. So never, ever stand in this position unless you're dealing with a smooth bowl, and even then, minimize the time you spend in this position. Stay over here as much as you can. Now that the outside is done and smooth, I'll go and concentrate on the inside. And you can see here from my position where I'm standing, again, I'm well out of the line of fire now. And I'm just going to work away at getting the inside of that as smooth as I can. The other thing I should mention, so far I've done this project all with my bowl gouge. Again, if you follow my channel, I thank you for that. When I do epoxy and wood mixes, generally I use a carbide. The epoxy doesn't usually cut well with the gouge, but I've got such a small amount here in a crack that it's really fine. It doesn't seem to be negatively affected by the bowl gouge, and that is the best tool to remove wood quickly and to give you a smooth surface. So I was fortunate to be able to use the bowl gouge for all of this project. You can see here now as I stop it, the beautiful hardwood and also the repair that I made where the epoxy is. Here you see me working on some of those fine cracks. I am going to go back and remove some of this material on the outside, but I did have some cracks here, so I just filled it with some CA glue and sawdust, rubbed that right in to those cracks, and then I came back later and cleaned it up. Especially when doing finish cuts, this is my preferred method. Ride the bevel in the bowl gouge and go uphill. That means starting down at the smaller diameter at the base and work the way up towards the rim. That means the cut is always supported because there's fibers in front of it, as opposed to coming the other way in which the fibers would not be supported. I'm just feeling for those cracks here, and they felt pretty smooth. I didn't show it, but I sanded this bowl as I usually do, from starting at 80 grit, working my way up to 600, and then I also use my abrasive paste on it, which wet sands it up to 1,000. The next thing I do is I take some mineral spirits on a rag and I wipe the bowl down. That just removes any residual sawdust. You don't want the sawdust to end up in your final finish. In this case, the finish that I applied is wipe-on poly. You can see that here. I just, again, dip my rag in and rub a generous amount on for the first coat to make sure that the wood soaks it all up. This wood was pretty smooth already and very tight, so it didn't actually soak up all that much. Once I applied the first coat, I let that dry. Then I use a Scotch-Brite pad, buff it out, wipe it down with mineral spirits again, and continue applying successive coats. And I think for this, I ended up applying 5 or 6 coats of wipe-on poly. Here's a great shot of the epoxy repair on this crotch piece. And I failed to mention it earlier. I know I told you it was apple. So of course, what epoxy do you use when repairing an apple? Candy apple red. Apple wood rarely lets you down. Look at the beautiful heartwood in this bowl. Even without the epoxy, this is a beautiful looking bowl. And the epoxy does add a nice finishing touch to it. Thank you for watching. Leave a comment. Let me know what you think of the bowl.